Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the time. I don't know if you've seen the headlines yet, Mr. Speaker. You've been busy with votes all day long, but the Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision today, struck down the National Labor Relations Board so-called recess appointments that the President made there over the Christmas season in 2011-2012. 9-0. I hear a lot about the Supreme Court being a divided body, Mr. Speaker. 9-0, the Supreme Court said that the President of the United States had absolutely no constitutional authority to name members of the National Labor Relations Board without Senate approval. They said that the recess appointment power that is provided to the President in the Constitution of the United States is not there so that the President of the United States can avoid Senate approval. It's there so that the nation can continue to run in the absence of the Senate being in session in order to give its approval. And, Mr. Speaker, the reason I bring that up is because that was yet another in a long line of decisions the President has made to ignore this body, to ignore the United States Senate, in fact, to ignore all of Article 1 of the Constitution. And that's not just a Republican from the state of Georgia saying that, Mr. Speaker. That's 9 Supreme Court justices, every single Supreme Court justice, the most liberal of the Supreme Court justices, saying the President vastly overstepped his authority and his actions were unconstitutional. Now, that's not news to anybody who's been following that case, Mr. Speaker. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals made that same decision, said that the President overstepped those bounds, and that was way back in 2012. I have a quote here from President George Washington's farewell address in 1796, Mr. Speaker. George Washington said this. He said, "It's important that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration." That's us, Mr. Speaker. That's representatives in government. That's the White House. That's the courts. That's the Congress. Should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. In his farewell address, George Washington said, in order for this country to succeed, these individual branches of government, the checks and balances created in the Constitution, the men and women entrusted with those responsibilities must resist encroaching on one another. Against that backdrop, Mr. Speaker, against the backdrop of our nation's first president, against the backdrop of, well, he's standing right out in a painting out here in the hallway, Mr. Speaker, George Washington presiding over the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, this man entrusted with the birthing of our country, with the understanding of the consent of the governed and how we can preserve our freedoms while administering our governmental responsibilities, said resist the opportunity to encroach on the powers of competing branches of government. What I have on this sheet, you can't see it, Mr. Speaker, but it's quotes from President Barack Obama, and not quotes from 20 years ago and not quotes from 10 years ago, but quotes from just the 3 years that I've been serving here in this body, just the 3 years that I've been entrusted with some responsibilities. Here in Article 1, the President says this. A speech at North Carolina State in January of this year, he said, "Where I can act on my own without Congress, I'm going to do so." President says, if I can do it without these other branches of government, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. George Washington says, avoid encroaching on one another. The Supreme Court says, Mr. President, when you step outside of your lane, 9-0, we're going to declare your actions unconstitutional. Those were actions taken back in 2012, Mr. Speaker. Even this year, the President continues down that path. State of the Union address this year, Mr. Speaker. America does not stand still, the President says, and neither will I. So whenever I can take steps without legislation, that's what I'm going to do. There's no confusion at the White House, Mr. Speaker. The President made those recess appointments that today the Supreme Court said in a unanimous decision were entirely unconstitutional. He wasn't confused about what he was doing. He didn't misunderstand what the Constitution said. He wasn't confused about what state the Senate was in. He knew they were not in recess. He decided that he would define what recess was. He decided that he would do it anyway. He decided he did not care if he encroached on the Senate's lane, that Article 2 came and trumped Article 1. February State of the Union Address, 2013, Mr. Speaker. The President says this: I urge this Congress to get together and pursue a bipartisan market-based solution to carbon change. But if Congress won't act soon to protect future generations, I will. Climate change. I can't go into a high school in my district, Mr. Speaker, without young people wanting to talk to me about the environment, wanting to talk to me about climate change. This is an issue of national concern. This isn't just the President's concern. It's an issue of national concern, obviously international concern. But the President's State of the Union address doesn't say, I'm going to take this concern, I'm going to win the hearts and minds of the American people, and I'm going to move legislation through Congress to enact my goals. He says, I hope Congress does what I want them to do, but if they don't, I'm going to do it anyway. It's exactly what he said with his recess appointments, Mr. Speaker, which today, again, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 was an unconstitutional action by this White House. Mr. Speaker, August of 2013, we were in the midst of the President proposing changes to Obamacare in that summer. He says this, he says, in a normal political environment, it would have been easier for me to simply call the Speaker, John Boehner, and say, you know what, this is a tweak that doesn't go to the essence of the law. It has nothing to do with, for example, where we're able to simplify the attestation of employers. They're already providing health insurance. It looks like there may be some better ways to do this. Let's make a technical change. The President says ordinarily what I'd do is I would call the Speaker of the House. Ordinarily, I would call the Congress and I would say, hey, I've got this little bitty idea, this little bitty tweak I'd like to make. Would you all work with me on legislation to do so? That would be the normal thing, the President says, that I would prefer to do. But we're not in a normal atmosphere around here when it comes to Obamacare. We have executive authority to do so, and we did so. So here's what the President says. He says, I know what the right thing to do is. I know that what the Constitution requires is that if I have an idea, that I contact the Congress, that Congress moves that idea through, that I put my signature on it, and it becomes the law of the land. I know that's the ordinary course of events. But these are not ordinary times, so I'm going to ignore those constitutional mandates, and I'm just going to do it myself. Said that about the enforcement of Obamacare, said that about his actions on climate change, said that about his appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, and the Supreme Court said, as did the District Court, that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all have an agenda that we want to pursue. I'd like to believe we're all focused on the improvement of this country. I'd like to believe we're all interested in opportunity for all American citizens. I'd like to believe we're all interested in growing jobs in the economy and protecting freedom. And the debate we have is about how to get to that place. And when one branch of government, Mr. Speaker, decides they're going to ignore the others and do it their way, the entire system breaks down. The court today spoke directly to that. Now, I want to contrast that, Mr. Speaker, because you might just think, hey, Congressman Woodall, you're a relatively new member from the great state of Georgia. You're just bitter because you're a Republican and there's a Democrat in the White House. Well, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. And I want to take you back, Mr. Speaker, to what previous presidents have said. You heard what this president has said. Congress ought to do what I tell them to do, and if they don't do it, I'm going to do it anyway. But that's not what previous presidents have said. Bill Clinton, December 1994, Mr. Speaker. Remember back December 1994, Republicans had just taken over the U.S. House for the first time in 60 years. 60 years, first time we had a Republican majority in Congress. And in 60 years, the President Clinton is only 2 years into his term, and he's looking at this brand new Congress, and he says this: not if Congress doesn't do what I tell them to do, I'm going to just roll over the top of them. Not if Congress doesn't do what I tell them to do, I'm just going to do it my way. Not I've got a pen and I've got a phone, but he says this. I hope with this new Congress. He goes on, he says, he's talking about the same environmental issues that President Obama's talking about. He says the most significant environmental gains of the last 30 years were made under a Democratic Congress and Republican President, Richard Nixon. We can work together again. And you know we did, Mr. Speaker. We did. Biggest tax reform bill in my lifetime, 1997, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich. Biggest welfare reform bill in my lifetime, 1996, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich. Biggest Medicare reforms in my lifetime, 1997, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich. That's what this country does, Mr. Speaker. We work together. We all have common goals, and we have different ways of getting there, but we work together. Our founders feared an all-powerful executive, Mr. Speaker, who would roll over the Congress and roll over the will of the people. Feared it. Set up the Constitution to prevent it. Other presidents have understood that. Ronald Reagan, he wasn't working with a friendly Congress. He was working with a Congress of the other party, and he said this. He said there were also pessimistic predictions about the relationship between our administration and this Congress. It was said that we could never work together. Well, those predictions were wrong. Together, we not only cut the increase in government spending nearly in half, we brought about the largest tax reductions and the most sweeping changes in our tax structure since the beginning of this century. Ronald Reagan, State of the Union Address, 1982. He'd been in office just over a year. Just over a year. And he worked with a Democratic Congress, a Republican president, and he did some of the most sweeping changes that this nation has seen in the past century. That's what we do. That's who we are as a people. President Kennedy, 1961. The answers are by no means clear. All of us together, this administration, this Congress, this nation, must forge those answers. Members of the Congress, the Constitution makes us not rivals for power, but partners for progress. I want you to hear the tone of those different statements. President John F. Kennedy, to the Congress, we are not rivals, but we are partners. President Reagan, to the Congress, they said we could never work together, but they were wrong. We brought the most sweeping changes since the beginning of this century. President Clinton, the most sweeping changes in the last 30 years were made with Democrats in Congress, Republicans in the White House working together. President Barack Obama, if Congress doesn't do what I tell them to do, I'm going to do it myself. Supreme Court today, 9-0 decision. What President Obama is doing is unconstitutional. And I tell you, Mr. Speaker, when folks are doing things that are unconstitutional, it threatens the very fabric of the freedoms that bind this country together. Mr. Speaker, it just so happens that the Supreme Court ruled on yet another unconstitutional action of the White House today. I hadn't actually anticipated that decision happening today. I came down to talk about the President's new environmental initiative. He wants to reduce carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions by 30%. He announced this policy from the White House, and the media covered it expansively. Here's Bloomberg, Mr. Speaker. President Obama's views addressing the problem of climate change as a key part of his legacy. Reuters, climate change is becoming a major legacy issue for Obama. USA Today, Obama clearly hopes to make this an important part of his legacy. These are all articles from the last 30 days, Mr. Speaker. Chicago Tribune, the president's hometown newspaper. Experts note this rule will spur the growth of cap-and-trade marketplaces in the states. In that sense, it may be remembered as a rare moment when Obama worked around the opposition in Congress to implement one of his top goals. Politico, if finalized next year and put into place, it would be one of Obama's largest legacy achievements. The New York Times, it would be the strongest action ever taken by an American president to tackle climate change and become one of the defining elements of Mr. Obama's legacy. Now, Mr. Speaker, you may be asking, Congressman Woodall, for Pete's sakes, you're talking about this being a major legacy issue from Reuters, an important part of the legacy from USA Today, remembered as a rare moment of success by the Chicago Tribune, Politico, largest legacy achievement. Administration, you may be asking, Mr. Speaker, so where's the legislation on Capitol Hill? Largest legacy achievement in the Obama administration. This is the administration that brought you Obamacare. This is the administration that brought you a complete re-regulation of the financial services industry. This administration that brought you all of these sweeping changes, the media says this next proposed change may be the largest yet. And there's not a single piece of legislation moving across this body to implement it. Because the President says, even though this is the biggest initiative of his career, even though this is the biggest change ever proposed, he does not need the approval of Congress to do it. He's going to do it on his own. Mr. Speaker, that's frightening. It's frightening. And the only way that he's allowed to do these things is if we can't work together in Congress to stop him. It seems to have become the pattern in my adult lifetime that Republican Congresses protect Republican presidents and Democratic Congresses protect Democratic presidents instead of Article 1 protecting the powers of the people while Article 2 tries to implement those authorities. Again, the President's not confused about what's happening here, Mr. Speaker. This is his director of the White House Office of Science and Technology. Just last month, he says clearly the President regards this 30% reduction in carbon emissions, as part of his legacy to really turn the country around on climate change, and he aims to get that done. I want you to think about this again, Mr. Speaker. Biggest initiative of the President's administration. His director of the Office of Science and Technology says the President aims to get this done. It's been covered by every media outlet in America, and there is not one piece of legislation on this floor to implement that. Because the President believes that the right way to do it is without winning the hearts and minds of the people, without winning the hearts and minds of Congress, but just doing it and letting the chips fall where they may. He's tried that over and over and over again. It's a pattern in this administration, a pattern that the Supreme Court unanimously finds unconstitutional. I want to take you to part of that Supreme Court decision, Mr. Speaker. From page 40 of that decision, the Recess Appointments Clause is not designed to overcome serious institutional friction. It simply provides a subsidiary method for approving officials when the Senate is away during a recess. Here, as in other contexts, friction between the branches is an inevitable consequence of our constitutional structure. Hear this, Mr. Speaker. The President's announced the largest environmental initiative of his agenda. Obviously, arguably, the largest initiative of his entire presidency. And he says, I don't care what Congress says, I'm going to do it by myself. This in the same month where the Supreme Court unanimously says, Mr. President, friction is not only natural in Congress and the White House, it's anticipated by the Constitution. And no, you cannot use your phone and your pen to avoid friction. We must work together. We must come together on an idea. We cannot operate independently. Recess Appointments Clause is not designed to overcome institutional friction. Friction between the branches is an inevitable consequence of our constitutional structure, a consequence the President would arguably like to avoid. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of shots here from this very same well where I gave a very similar speech almost 2 years ago, where we talked about these very same issues as the President embarked on those original actions that led to this Noel Canning decision today. Mr. Speaker, those words went unheeded. Those words went unheeded. The American people want to trust their President. The American people want to believe in their President. I want to trust my President. I want to believe in my President. But we cannot sacrifice constitutional principles in the name of expediency so that any one person can pursue their agenda. Working together has always been essential in the fabric of this nation. Mr. Speaker, 2 years from now, we cannot wake up as we did 2 years from the day that I gave this speech, where we knew the Constitution was at risk, where we knew, rather than winning the hearts and minds of the American people and the Congress, the President just did it his own way, where we knew that there was a better pathway forward, but so many in this chamber said nothing. So many across the hall in the Capitol in the United States Senate, Mr. Speaker, said nothing. So many, in the name of supporting their party, were complicit in undermining their Constitution. Mr. Speaker, today is a day that we can reset that clock. We're in the midst of a major policy initiative, this 30% reduction in carbon, that the President owes it to all of us to go out and win the hearts and minds of the people, win the commitment of Congress to make that the law of the land. George Washington, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The very fabric of the Constitution, the very fabric of the beginning of our country, Mr. Speaker, who we are as a people, necessitates friction between the branches and cooperation to wield the people's power. The President said he was doing the right thing for the right reasons 2.5 years ago, Mr. Speaker, when he made those recess appointments. The appellate court of the United States of America said, you are doing the wrong things, they are unconstitutional. The President said, I don't believe you, take it to the Supreme Court. I've got friends there. The Supreme Court said 9-0. You are violating the Constitution when you use your phone and your pen to get this work done instead of seeking the approval of Congress. We can throw our hands up, Mr. Speaker, and say the ends justify the means. We can say it's just too hard to work together. We might as well just do our own thing. George Washington cautioned us in his farewell address that that would be where human nature would lead us. But this is an institution that is full of conscientious men and women who took an oath to serve their constituency and to serve this nation and to serve this Constitution. We have an opportunity today, Mr. Speaker, not a partisan opportunity, not a House or Senate opportunity, but an opportunity given to us by the Supreme Court of the United States to reset the clock on this relationship. For those of us who have always known these actions were unconstitutional, I confess it's a bit of a validation. But for those who might have been defending this dictatorial action as something that was perhaps permitted in some small way under this Constitution, now have the certainty that they need. Not a 5-4 majority, not a 4-4-1 plurality, but a 9-0 unanimous decision that if we are to move forward in this country, we are to move forward together with Article 1, Congress passing the law, and Article 2, White House enforcing the law. We can do this, Mr. Speaker, and we owe it to the American people to do exactly that. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back. With the Speaker's announced policy